Hey everybody. So between the ill-fated travel ban and the disclosure yesterday that National Security Advisor Mike Flynn probably had improper contacts with the Russians, it's been a very bad week for the Trump administration. And I'd like to talk about these two circumstances because I think they speak volumes about what the Trump administration is all about and what we're likely to see in the future. Let's start with Mike Flynn. Just to give a little context, back on December 29th, President Obama, because of the Russian interference in the American elections, imposed sanctions on the Russians. December 29th, he booted out 35 Russian envoys and imposed several other burdens on the Russians. Now, everybody expected that the Russians, as per their MO, would retaliate by kicking American diplomats out of Russia. It didn't happen. Well, that was a surprise because invariably the Russians operate on a tit-for-tat basis. Shortly thereafter, the Washington Post revealed that soon-to-be National Security Advisor Mike Flynn had had contacts with the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Sergei Kiselak, on the very day that Obama imposed the sanctions. So here you have this odd coincidence where our president imposes sanctions and a member of Donald Trump's transition team is calling up the Russian ambassador. Not only did he call him up, he spoke to him 5 times. Now, the American ambassador to Russia under Barack Obama, Mike McFall, once he got wind of Mike Flynn's behavior, he immediately tweeted, "I dealt with Kiselak all the time when I worked at White House. Never needed to call him 5 times in one day to make my point." Obviously, this was a source of some embarrassment to Mike Flynn, but he reassured everybody who asked, including Vice President Mike Pence, Press Secretary Sean Spicer, and every news organization, that there was nothing improper discussed in those contexts. They didn't talk about the sanctions. These were simply Christmas greetings and discussions about the logistics of Trump and Putin meeting after Trump became president. Well, there are a couple ironies about this situation that I'd like to point out. First of all, Mike Flynn was once the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He apparently was too naive to realize that when he made those contacts with Kiselak, that our intelligence services had the wherewithal to intercept what was being said. So he apparently thought that he was talking privately when American intelligence was able to pick up everything that was being said. How odd that a guy who had occupied that position wouldn't realize that. Yesterday, the news broke that in fact he had talked to the Russians about the American sanctions. So the inference is overwhelming that he gave the Russians a little wink and a nod and a suggestion that Trump was going to lift the sanctions. Because let's look at the sequence of events. Obama imposes sanctions. Flynn calls up Kiselak, talks to him 5 times. Then the next day, Putin comes out and says, well, in the interest of improving relations with the United States, we're not going to retaliate. Oh, really? You always retaliate. Why is this time different? Well, because obviously a nice little kabuki dance had been choreographed where Flynn calls Kiselak, makes promises, Putin then backs off, and then the next day Donald Trump tweeted, "Great move on delay by Vladimir Putin. I always knew he was very smart." Totally choreographed. So there are 2 points that I want to make about this. First of all the focus is on, is Mike Flynn going to survive? Mike Flynn lied to Vice President Mike Pence, who then went out and made false representations based on that information. That's not really the issue. Here's the point that doesn't seem to be getting discussed enough. Mike Flynn would never have gone and made such promises to the Russians had he not already cleared it with President-elect Donald Trump. Mike Flynn may be a rogue operator, but he's not so rogue that he's going to go and tell the Russians, yes, we're going to lift the sanctions once we're in power, unless he and Trump have gotten together. In fact, probably unless Trump had already given Flynn those assurances and had dispatched Flynn to go talk to the Russians. So this isn't an issue of whether Mike Flynn is in legal trouble, whether Mike Flynn may have violated the Logan Act, which prevents such communications with an enemy like the Russians. This is an issue of whether the president-elect and his soon-to-be national security advisor conspired to go to the Russians and deliberately undermine the sanctions the very day that they were imposed. I mean, this is a very serious issue, but it's at least as serious an issue for Donald Trump as it is for Mike Flynn. Now, the second issue that I want to bring up is that, the Logan Act is never enforced. It's never invoked. It was enacted in 1799. It's an ancient statute. But the more important fact is the FBI almost certainly questioned Mike Flynn during the period of its investigation, which is ongoing. Mike Flynn seems to have lied to the FBI. Now, how many times have we seen a government official go to jail, not for the underlying crime, which may have been unethical, highly embarrassing, probably illegal, but very hard to prove in a court of law, not for that crime, but for lying about it afterward? That's probably what's going to happen to Mike Flynn. So the biggest jeopardy, I believe, for Mike Flynn isn't so much whether he violated the Logan Act, it's did he lie to the FBI? So let's move on to the next issue, which was the ill-conceived, ill-fated travel ban. The opinion by the Ninth Circuit is 29 pages long and a bit dense, and unless you actually read the opinion in its entirety, you don't get the full flavor of the smackdown that the Ninth Circuit gave the government, the Trump administration. They basically rejected every claim of the Trump administration. They rejected the issue of whether they had jurisdiction, whether Washington and Minnesota had standing to sue. They rejected the notion that they had given adequate due process to all the immigrants involved. There were all kinds of representations by the government that were rejected by the three-panel court. But the most important thing that they rejected, and one that sort of has kind of gotten lost in the shuffle, they questioned the underlying rationale for the executive order in the first place. They pointed out in their opinion that the Trump administration offered no evidence that there was any emergency afoot, that there was any urgent need for a change in our immigration policy. And let me read you what they said, because it's very interesting. I quote, "Despite the district courts and our own repeated invitations to explain the urgent need for the executive order to be placed immediately into effect, the government submitted no evidence. The government submitted no evidence to rebut the state's argument that the district court's order merely returned the nation temporarily to the position it has occupied for many previous years." I continue. "The government has pointed to no evidence that any alien from any of the countries named in the order has perpetrated a terrorist attack in the United States. Rather than present evidence to explain the need for the executive order, the government has taken the position that we must not review its decision at all. We disagree." So that's a complete smackdown of the Trump administration position. Now, the court did say, yes, it's traditional. It is appropriate for a court to give great deference to a president in matters of national security. But that does not equate to giving the president a carte blanche. That doesn't give the president unlimited, unreviewable power. We always have the ability to make sure that a president's actions comport with the Constitution. And here's the thing I want to say about this. Donald Trump, during the time that he's president, for as long as that is going to see innumerable lawsuits. Because that's who he is. Court cases, lawsuits follow him around like flies. He's the chaos candidate, after all. But one of the things you'll never hear a judge talk about, but will play a role in every lawsuit from now going forward, is that in the first month of his presidency, Donald Trump has clearly established himself universally as the greatest bullshit artist in the history of the presidency. I mean, the judges read the newspapers just as we do. When they hear Donald Trump say 1.5 million people attended my inauguration, when the judges hear Trump say 5 million people have voted illegally, and that's what gave Hillary Clinton her popular vote victory, when the judges hear Trump say to a gathering of sheriffs, no less, that the murder rate is at its highest in 47 years, when the judges hear President Trump say that the press refuses to cover terrorist attacks as fully as they should, when the judges hear Donald Trump say that Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch, when using words like demoralizing and disheartening to describe attacks against the judiciary, when they hear Trump say that, well, Gorsuch wasn't talking about me, they know that this guy is such an inveterate liar that there is no proffer of information that the government makes that can be taken on face value. So the deference given to Donald Trump is going to shrink in every court case that he participates in because he is so incapable of telling the truth about anything. So when he tells the Ninth Circuit that the terrorists are knocking at the door, or that we're moments away from the next terrorist attack, it rings as hollow as his statements that there is carnage all over the country, or that the Georgia congressional district of Congressman John Lewis is infested with crime and poverty. They understand that Donald Trump is the greatest exaggerator and fabricator in the history of American politics. He lies about stuff that there's no need to lie about. And there's no prospect of that changing because, as we've seen, Donald Trump is incapable of change. He doesn't really lie because he wants to lie. He lies because he can't help but lie. That's just part of his character structure. So if I can sum up, we've learned something really important about what the Trump administration is going to be like. And I don't think it's going to be any different for the next 30 months than has been in the last month. Between the ill-considered and ill-executed Yemen raid, between the ill-executed and ill-considered rollout of the Trump cabinet nominees, who were replete with ethical problems and problems with their qualifications, and the travel ban, which was hastily considered and incredibly recklessly implemented, this is what we're going to see from the Trump administration. A lack of reflection, a haste to act without any real organization or clarity, and after problems are created by these previous characteristics, a complete lack of honesty with the American people. Trump is still telling us, for example, that the Yemen raid, which killed 24 civilians, one elite American soldier, and caused the Yemeni government to withdraw their authorization for us to operate on their soil. That was a terribly executed raid. Trump tells us it was a great success. So all of this portends something very bad for this country. If I can use the common phrase of Donald Trump, what we've seen so far portends a huge disaster for this country. Hey, I hope I'm wrong. I'm Jeff Rowan. Thanks for watching.